The COVID-19 financial discussion now, it was always known that the economic impact of the coronavirus and the lockdown would be brutal. That's why government announced a COVID-19 rescue package to cushion the blow. But there are now concerns that the impact of the spending could be undermined by corruption as the overall impact of the economic losses becomes clearer. Now, this week, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development said that a recovery could differ wildly depending on whether there is a second wave of coronavirus infections or not. In a worst case scenario, it predicts that the South African economy could contract by more than 8% and hardly recover next year. To discuss, we're joined by Dr Azar Jammine from Econometrix. Azar, great to have you with us as always. So we know it's going to be very bad this year. Maybe better psychologically to start looking ahead to next year to see how quickly we can recover from this economic pain, what's expected after we go through the peak. What do you think, firstly, of the OECD's prediction that if there's one wave of infections, so let's look at the best case scenario, we'll fall by 7.5% this year, but grow by 2.5% next year?
I think that's more or less in line with what people are anticipating. I think 2.5% could turn out to be a little conservative, depending on what happens with the COVID virus over time. And it's the general expectation for the world economy, really, that next year should be better than this year. You'll be coming off a very low base. The unfortunate part is that even if you do have growth next year, both for the international economy and the South African economy, you will still not be back by the end of next year, back at where you were in 2019, let alone 2018 or the years before that.
So explain the numbers. Does this suggest it will take many years just to get back to where we were before COVID-19?
I think there's a general expectation. Optimists are saying that it won't be before 2022 that the world economy will be back to where it was pre-COVID. And for South Africa, optimists are saying it won't be before 2023, 2024 that we'll get back to where we were pre-COVID.
Sure. And in the worst case scenario that this global think tank has put forward, when there's a second wave of infections, maybe at the end of the year, then we fall by 8.2% this year and we only grow by 0.6% next year. So that's less than 1%. How devastating is that?
That would be totally devastating. And, let's not at the moment think about a second wave. We're still in the first wave, as far as I'm concerned, in South Africa. And for that matter, in the rest of the world, we're seeing increases in infections of the order of 300,000 per week, per day. And we're seeing increases in the number of deaths from COVID at the rate of about 6.5 to 7,000 per day internationally. In South Africa, we're seeing increases in infections at the rate of 10 to 12,000 per day, and the number of deaths is increasing at a rate of around 300 per day.
Now, it's also being reported today, the business day, that the tax losses due to the lockdown exceed the value of the loans that we've had to take out from the likes of the IMF. That's still being discussed by the SABC. So we're losing the money coming in and taking on more debt. How's our debt burden looking right now?
Well, we've got to actually take on the debt from some source or the other. And this is what the SACP doesn't actually tell people. If we don't go to the IMF, then we've got to borrow from capital markets. And the interest rate at which we borrow from those markets are currently anywhere between 8 and 11%, depending on the duration of the bond that is issued to make up for the shortfall between government spending and what the government receives in revenue. The beauty about the IMF loan is that it gives us a little bit of a break on 70 billion rand out of the 775 billion rand that we have to borrow this year. In other words, for about 10% of our debt that we have to borrow, we're getting at 1.1%. So really, to start criticizing that, I think, is very foolhardy, because we have to borrow the money. Otherwise, how else are we going to get through this?
The IMF loan of 70 billion rand is not even that big. If you look at the size of the budget, like over a trillion rand, and the size of the economy as well. Like you say, so it is cheap debt, not many restrictions. It's been widely reported on, but overall our debt burden, I guess it's each of these loans adding up to what we already had before, and leading us to the OECD warning that the debt could exceed 100% of GDP in 2022. Explain how serious that is for a country our size.
For a country, it's not so much for a country our size that it is serious. It's for a country like us where our long-term interest rates, where the cost of borrowing is in the order of 8 to 10, 11%. Unlike the cost of borrowing for the United States or Britain or Europe or Japan, where in some instances in Japan and Europe, they actually, investors who buy these bonds have to pay the government interest in order to get those bonds. In other words, minus 0.5%. We have to pay 8 to 10% per year. So by going to the IMF and getting a loan, and the New Development Bank and hopefully the World Bank soon, and getting some loans which are not terribly arduous in terms of the conditions that are being imposed, by getting those loans at 1.1% per annum instead of 8 to 10% per annum, we will effectively be saving around 8 to 9 billion rand of government spending every year that would otherwise have had to go on servicing debt. And that 8 or 9 billion rand can be used more effectively on education, healthcare, security, housing, whatever the government feels is absolutely vital, and hopefully not towards corrupt practices.
Yeah, well, talking about the claims of corruption, what's your opinion on what government has done? I certainly don't agree with those who say there should have been no lockdown. Government had to do something. But has there been unnecessary economic pain? So claims of corruption, then we hear the cigarette ban has given all the tax revenue to the black market. We'll see what happens with the alcohol ban. There are 2 doctors now saying that the bed pressure isn't as bad as maybe thought, so maybe that will be lifted in coming weeks. But what's your assessment on what economic moves the government has made?
It's a question I've been asking from the beginning of the lockdown, whether it was worth the effort. I have to accept the medical expertise that says the initial lockdown was important to buy us time. Our mortality rate, fatality rate as a percentage of the number of infections that have been identified is still relatively low. And I can only believe that the stories that's because our healthcare facilities have had time to actually prepare for the virus. But I think there was a tremendously favorable buy-in to the program when it was originally announced. There has been a tremendous amount of opposition to the fact that a lot of the measures that were introduced seemed to be ad hoc and not sufficiently well thought out. And more than that, now there is an absolute national furore over the redirection of some of the measures taken towards just enriching some politically connected individuals. I think it's extremely serious. I'm delighted to see the popular uprising against this corruption. It's unfortunate. I would hope that it's a case of the spurt of corruption coming to a climax after a decade in which it has built up over, and that this popular uprising against it, and it being highlighted by people like yourselves on a continuous basis, may actually start producing the results in terms of determining a death knell for corruption. You've got no idea how much money we can suddenly find ourselves saving and being able to redeploy towards more productive resources if we actually bring corruption under control.
Yeah, and looking at those inflated prices for goods as well. So we desperately need investment. Can even these claims of corruption affect that? As I guess it all depends how government deals with what's going on right now.
Unfortunately, anecdotal evidence suggests that corruption is now proving to become has become a significant deterrent to investment because investors just do not have the confidence of getting into deals. I have heard of a lot of stories where they want to get ahead with an investment, but the moment they're faced with a little hand that actually says no, but up front we want this, they just pull out of the picture completely.
All right, thank you so much. An economic assessment relating to COVID-19. That was Dr. Azar Jammine from Econometrix.